Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session entitled Talking Ethics with Cops. I'm Scott Gage. I'm a captain with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department in charge of our training function. And with us this afternoon, Sheriff of Los Angeles County, Jim McDonald, and his recently retired undersheriff and inspiration for today's talk, Neal Tyler. Before we get started, I want to play a real quick video for you. It's kind of an introduction to who the LA County Sheriff's Department is. Hope so.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon. I'd like to ask Captain Scott Gage of our Training Bureau if he would roll a second video clip. I think it'll give a little bit more depth.
The honor recruit for Class 411 from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Recruit Harold Adams.
Why I wanted to be a deputy was the way I was raised from my father to, always have integrity, to do what's right, and law enforcement is the best way to do it, and that's why I wanted to come to be a deputy sheriff. The last thing that my grandfather said to me before he passed away shortly of cancer was to be the best. And I hold that promise to him to this day, and I will continue to hold this promise to be the best deputy that I can be for this department. With that said, I don't believe that I'm the best recruit in Class 411. I believe I'm just a mere reflection of the class in front of you. Because without my partners of Class 411, I could not have accomplished a fraction of what has led me here today. Thank you, Class 411. To my mother, I love you, and thank you. Thank you very much. I couldn't have done it without you guys. I look up to every one of you guys. You guys motivate me. Stay strong, be physically fit and morally straight, and go home at the end of each day. And thank you.
Well, I think these videos symbolize what we all really want to achieve for our organizations, attracting the very best into our profession, getting them trained for thriving careers. But as we all know, careers don't always thrive, but we can do more work on that to make our folks successful. We all know too well that law enforcement has gone through a very rough period in our nation's history, and there are many reasons for that, some which are not in our control. This presentation is about something that is within our control, something that we can do right now. To begin emerging from the rough period, to protect our profession from future grief, one thing is always in our minds: cops' lives are at risk each day that we serve the public. What we don't always keep in mind are the other non-physical threats to police officers across the country as well. These threats are inherent in what society expects police to do. Here they are, permanently a part of police work. We give tremendous power to young, inexperienced officers to accomplish a very difficult and complex task. Then we expect these new adults to figure out how to use all that power, but with wisdom and restraint. And we send them out into society full of pressures and temptations that can derail their careers, cost them their jobs, or even their freedom, and do damage to our profession's reputation. As police leaders, we're accountable for the actions and behavior of our cops, and are also accountable for their welfare. We owe it to the people we bring into policing to help them protect themselves from this perpetually threatening combination of power, temptation, and pressure that is fairly unique to law enforcement. The most critical position to the task, clearly, all of you know as well, sergeants, our first-line supervisors. No other rank has so much personal influence on the people out there doing the job. No other rank has the same opportunities to guide and mold officers toward thriving careers and excellence in public safety and service. Sergeants manage the reputation of every police organization without ever really thinking about the importance of their every word. I can't stress enough how critical a role sergeants play, and that's no surprise to any of you here today. We can do more to assist our sergeants in fulfilling our high expectations of them. Therefore, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department has invested in our own sergeants to improve their mentoring and leadership skills, to inspire them to take better care of the deputies who work for and with them. We're adopting an approach based on a recently published book titled Talking Ethics with Cops, written by one of my co-presenters here, Neal Tyler. And I know what you're thinking sitting there, okay, this is a book tour. Well, I know we all think the same way, but not the case. Neal has taken any profits made from this and donating all of them directly to the National Peace Officers Memorial in D.C. Neal retired this past March after a 40-year career that ended with his serving in the capacity of undersheriff for the last 3 years, where he was a tremendous partner to me in my transition into the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Before that, he had spent much of his career working to develop practical, effective ways of improving the decision-making of our most precious resources, the officers who do the police work that help keep our public safe. Neal developed this program and is passionate about it. He loves the profession, and his reason for being here is to give back. Neal will now explain our investment in our sergeants in greater detail.
Thank you, Sheriff. Good afternoon. Okay, I want to talk with you all about police work for a few minutes. Here's the situation. 22:30 hours. Officer A requests assistance via detaining one suspect, a felony suspect at gunpoint. Units hear this, they start rolling to his location. One unit with Officer B in it rolls from the police station. He's not as close as the other units, but he's bound and determined to get there. This unit is driven by Officer B, who is a very skilled, popular street cop in his agency, who is known for hard charging, high arrest statistics, and also for aggressive, if not often reckless driving, known to supervisors and peers alike. Officer B is rolling down a major boulevard at 22:30 hours at 80 miles an hour plus on a street designed for 40 miles an hour. My question for the audience, which officer needed assistance more that night at that particular moment? Officer A holding a felony suspect, or Officer B driving his car in the manner I described? I'd like some participation here to make sure you stay awake. Shout out an answer. I hear more B's than I hear A's. Anybody think A needed more assistance? All right, thank you. I appreciate your identifying what I believe to be the case. I can tell you that Officer B had a passenger, happened to be his trainee, because this officer was an FTO. And if I ask you who needed assistance more between B and his trainee, I'd just be playing with your minds. But I can tell you that what I'd like to know now are your thoughts about when did Officer B need the assistance? At that moment, or maybe another time? I'm sorry? When he was a trainee. Excellent. Any other thoughts? I'm sorry? Every day. Okay. Every day anybody who knew him and cared about him saw that he was still driving like a nutcase and had a chance to tune him up. And that doesn't mean, from whom? I'll ask, from whom? A sergeant? I heard a sergeant? Peers. Okay, those are my two answers. Sergeants or peers, either one, whoever cared about him the most. What kind of assistance are we talking about? Taking him to the woodshed somehow. Well, thank you very much for participating and your additional thoughts. In this case, I'm sorry to say there's no evidence that deputy or officer, well, I'll just tell you the truth. He's a deputy in my department, or he was. Officer B, there was no evidence after that night that Officer B ever got the kind of assistance he needed from supervisors or peers alike. And there is evidence that he didn't, and it's presented on your screen up there. I'm afraid he died in a car crash, losing control of his car. The trainee that was with him was disabled for life and had to retire. And unfortunately, this is only one, and a very dramatic one, of the thousands of examples of missed opportunities that we, supervisors and peers alike, come to the assistance of fellow officers or subordinates when they need assistance. And many of them don't result in death, but they result in other kinds of grief. So I'm going to postulate here that despite our belief that cops always roll to assist another in jeopardy, it just doesn't come out in the wash that way in reality. We don't actually come through for each other the way we say we will. And many times they're not in dramatic situations like this, and they result in embarrassing misconduct, they result in the pain of injured or damaged careers, and they result in reputation damage to us. So I'm up here because I believe we in this business can do better at taking care of each other and consistently demonstrating the courage and resolve to assist each other with things like tough love and intervention and subjects that are less popular to talk about, but I group them under the term mentoring. Raise your hands if you have gotten through your career so far without having made any mistakes at all. Look around the room, nobody's hands up, thank heavens, okay? I spent 40 years with the LA County Sheriff's Department, and I managed to make mistakes at every single rank. I started as a reserve deputy, and I ended up as the undersheriff, and every single rank, I emphasize. And that makes me a great knowledge resource for the Sheriff's Department and a potentially really valuable mentor. But only if I, thank you, Sheriff, share my wisdom, that hard-gained knowledge that I got through the School of Hard Knocks with other people. And that is the gist of this approach that we're going to be talking about, systematizing and strengthening our mentoring efforts. Now, I spent 13 years as a top-level executive in the Sheriff's Department with 3 as the undersheriff, and therefore I was responsible for assisting the sheriff in administering discipline. One of my least favorite tasks. Everybody else who's done it will have the same response to it. It is an awesome and awful responsibility to make a decision that can permanently impair another's career. It's necessary and it's awful. It's also gut-wrenching, especially when, even for the worst policy violators, you end up wondering after discharging them if there's something we as supervisors or managers or even peers could have done to prevent the mishap that caused the discharge. Did we do enough to prevent them making the mistake? Is there something we can do more in the future? And it was the gut-wrenching that led me to develop this approach that I term Talking Ethics with Cops and to assemble the material in this book. I wrote the book because I love police work, because I think it's a noble cause. That makes me like everybody in this office, our audience. I wrote it because I have a great deal of empathy for the fallible people that we bring into this career. As the sheriff mentioned, we bring them in and turn them loose with power and all that stuff out there in society that's ready to set them on the wrong course. And I feel a great deal of empathy for them about that. And thirdly, because I become convinced in my career that the most effective ethics mentors and ethics leaders we can possibly find for law enforcement are already in law enforcement. And they are, in particular, our sergeants, trusted, trustworthy, respected, caring supervisors who understand mentoring and know how to and when to apply mentoring skills. Now, the book was recently published, and as the sheriff said, I'm sending the author's proceeds to the National Law Enforcement Museum and Memorial. Whether the book sells or not, I'm hoping the approach that's outlined in the book can help other agencies fulfill our obligation to the people I just talked about, the ones we're bringing into these careers and hoping that will grow and thrive, but it won't happen automatically. This approach is based on what I've learned from over 30 years of practical experience in discussing ethics and decision-making in police work with our deputies and other officers. Now, that's 30 years during which I have either made or figured out most of the mistakes possible in the business of talking ethics with cops. And I've also experienced all the feelings and fears that create disincentives to try. And that's what's in the book in part, is ways that sergeants can overcome the disincentives and the fears and avoid the mistakes and do a really, really good job of enjoying mentoring cops about ethics in police work. The approach is very simple. It can be summarized on a 2-item slide. First, as Sheriff McDonald said, investing in our sergeants. The sergeants are a powerful, influential, trustworthy team to be trained and inspired and then mobilized at little or no cost toward more consistent, more frequent mentoring of their personnel about how police work is best done. They can be more effective with their officers than outside experts we might bring in because they work with their officers and they dress in the same locker room and they were their officers and they've done police work. They can be shown techniques for talking with cops, not at them, which is a common mistake made in law enforcement ethics training. And without even using the word ethics, talking about decision-making in police work, sergeants can be as effective as anybody. And I'll say more effective than I can, because even though I've got a lot of practice at this, I had too many stars on my collar for most of our deputies to pay much attention to what I learned in police work in the 1980s. So, current sergeants, the ones they're working with. Sergeants can also be shown techniques for getting cops to talk with each other so that they can develop their own leadership skills about relating to each other and potentially can improve their leadership skills about ethics without even knowing it's happening to them. Basically, this has to do with accelerating the development of wisdom in cops who are going to learn it one way or another from the School of Hard Knocks or from a briefing session when a sergeant talked with them about a mistake somebody else made. And what I'm hoping will happen is that the sergeants will be talking with the deputies in a manner that expands what the term officer needs assistance means to those deputies and officers, and they'll understand that it has to include things like the tough love or the intervention that this deputy up here could have used before he got in that car crash, and many, many hundreds of other deputies and officers that I'm already aware of who I was involved in the discharges or the discipline of. Okay, second element, it's mining that untapped mother lode of past mistakes and misconduct documented in previous personnel investigations about decisions gone wrong and converting it into something that your officers are naturally interested in talking about, and that is stories and debriefings about police work. Note, I didn't use the word ethics there. Practical, succinct discussion material is in the material we've created here about police decision-making, ideas to use it recurrently, have sergeants use it recurrently, at interactive briefings and meetings and in-service training and wherever else there's a collection of officers that you can talk with, not at, about how police work is done. The book contains over 20 such narratives that are basically exercises that sergeants can take their people through in a manner that I'm going to role play and demonstrate in just a second. I'll tell you that the handouts that are on the table back there, the second handout, which is the one that's got the real fine print and double-sided, it's got a lot of the material right out of the book. So it gives you an idea what kinds of things are taken on in the material that was collected and put into this approach about talking ethics with cops, where there's no shying away from controversial topics, and it covers a gamut of ways people can get in trouble in this business, which you'll see as you look at the handout number 2. Okay, I am going to step to the center of the room and ask you guys to picture yourselves as a bunch of officers. Now, normally, I wouldn't recommend that any sergeant take on a briefing with whatever's in here, 100 or so people. And there are a lot of ways to modify this material so it can work in big groups, but it'd be ideal as if you had a normal-sized shift where the sergeant knows the people in the room. They've worked with them. He's their trusted sergeant for the last 12, 18 months. And he knows them. They know him. There should be a relationship of trust between them. And you'll see what kind of material is in the book that enables sergeants to have a guided discussion about a real police incident. So I'm going to step over here while they change my microphone, and I'll be right with you as your sergeant, okay? Okay, hey, that was slick transition. Okay. Good evening, shift briefing, or watch briefing people. Tonight we're done with the Arch file, and I have a story I want to run by you about a police incident that actually happened. I'd like your input on it. I'd like your thoughts on it. You know, I don't know everything about police work, and this is a meaty story with some hard decisions that officers involved had to make. So without further ado, I'll take you through it. There are these two officers, Ford and Lee. Ford is the training officer. Lee is the trainee. They have been on training for 5 months together, and Officer Lee is in a one-person car. Am I doing okay? Okay, all right. Okay, just figured it out. Okay, Officer Lee is in a one-person car. Officer Ford is in another car. They're working roughly in tandem, but pretty separately. Officer Ford near the end of day shift on a Sunday, makes a traffic stop on a lone male motorist. He does a warrant check. He frisks the suspect for weapons, and he finds methamphetamine in this person's jacket pocket. He then calls Officer Lee on his radio and says, "Come to my location at Walk and Don't Walk. I have something for you." Officer Lee rolls, gets to where Ford is. Ford says, "Hey, I made this arrest. Do you want to take it?" What do you think Officer Lee said? Officers? Said, "Sure, I'll take your arrest." So Officer Ford leaves Officer Lee with the responsibility of taking this guy into custody, taking him to the station, booking him, and writing the police arrest report. On the way to the station, Officer Lee hears a request for backup about a man with a gun call. So he rolls to that pretty fast and bounces the suspect around a little bit, but he gets him safely to the station and books him, and then he writes the police report, writing that he, Officer Lee, had made the original observation, the original traffic stop, searched the suspect for weapons, and personally found the dope in the suspect's jacket pocket. At the start of day watch the next morning, Officer Lee tells his training officer, Ford, "Hey, I packed my mud on that arrest. I wrote the report. Here's how I wrote it," and leaves Officer Ford with a decision to make. This is where I'd like some interaction, my officers. What do you think Officer Ford did in reaction to Officer Lee's notification that he'd written the report incorrectly? And I don't need people to raise their hand, nor do I need you to hit the mic. If you can say it loud enough, what choices does Ford have? He says, "Great, go with it," which is tantamount to doing nothing. What else do I hear? I'm sorry? Correct the report. Now, if this were a briefing, I wouldn't be yelling at my deputies or my officers, of course. We'd be sitting at a briefing table or a meeting or a training session. So you won't have the problem of your guys shouting and trying to have the answers repeated. Yeah, I've heard two options so far. Correct the report. Anybody think of anything else that Officer Ford might find it appropriate to do besides correct the report or do nothing? I'm sorry. Oh, train him, yeah. Tell Officer Lee, slap, slap, don't do it that way again. I'm sorry? Ask him why he did it. Another option? Okay, so he's suggesting ways to bring Officer Lee along in a more reasonable fashion than just telling him, "Bad dog down, don't do that again," by letting him think it through, which is excellent. There's another step Officer Ford owes his agency, though, don't you think? Something that has to happen after they leave that radio car, and maybe pretty soon. Anybody? Okay, thank you. He has to report it. So the basic three options this guy had or has are notify a sergeant, do nothing, and then there's an intermediate one. Try to get the suspect released without letting the sergeant know why you're asking. Hide from the sergeant the fact that your trainee made this mistake, but still get this guy out of jail so he's not falsely prosecuted and somebody might be going to prison for perjury, right? Which one do you think Officer Ford picked? I'm sorry. I'm sorry? Okay, now one person thinks he did nothing. Who thinks he might have done nothing? Just go ahead and raise hands so I can pick on someone else. Anybody want to tell me why you think he did nothing? Why do you think an officer in that position would do nothing, go back, go in the field, continue the day, maybe tell his trainee don't do it again, or don't tell him that? Why? What would motivate that? Sorry? He's complicit. That's possible. 10-9? I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, the rationalization the suspect had the dope, and gee, what's the problem here? It's easier. It's certainly easier. Okay, does anybody in this room think that Officer Ford might have said, "We're going to fix this. I'm going to get this guy released. You let me handle it. Don't do this again. I'm going to go to the sergeant and tell him, interest of justice, don't ask me any questions. We need to release this suspect. Sergeant, don't ask me any more." Who likes that one? As not as a valid one, but as something he might have done. Raise your hand if you think he might have thought of that and tried to slip it by the sergeant. Gosh, nobody thinks that? Okay, then some of you guys must think he did the right thing and notified the sergeant, right? Raise your hand if you think that's a possibility. Now, some of you guys aren't raising your hand because you figure, why would Tyler have written up one where he did the right thing? Good guess, okay. In this case, without tormenting my officers anymore, I'll tell you, I'm afraid this officer did nothing. He told the trainee not to do it that way again, and he went, what we call 10-8 in our agency, he went back in service and did not notify a sergeant. So whether he was actively or unconsciously thinking what this gentleman pointed out about, hey, what's the difference? The suspect's dirty. We don't know. He wasn't asked those questions when this unfolded. The suspect had injured his knee. He bashed it into the back of the radar car when he was rolling with the driver, Officer Lee, not too fast, but a little bit fast. So he complains to the sergeant. The sergeant starts looking into the issue of this guy's injured, bruised knee, and he's confused by the fact that the sergeant describes the officer who arrested him initially and searched him differently from the officer who drove him all around town on the call before he took him to jail. But the sergeant doesn't know what happened yet, and he's going to be open-minded. So he sends an MDC message the next day, the same day that the trainee notified his FTO about what he'd done, to the trainee. And the MDC message says, hey, I'm looking into a beef by the suspect you took to jail. His injured knee is no big deal, but tell me, whose arrest was this anyway? Because I'm confused about his description of the physical, description of the person who arrested him. And the trainee MDCs the sergeant back that it was all his arrest from the outset. So in other words, he tells the sergeant a falsehood in his MDC message. The sergeant's confused. He still doesn't know, well, how come he's describing two different guys? So he runs across Officer Ford in the station house, just by accident. He wasn't looking for him. And he sees his chance to clear it up. He asks Officer Ford, hey, the suspect and, the description, and they don't check, and whose arrest was this anyway? That gave Officer Ford a decision. This occurred about 2 hours after Ford had just learned that his trainee muffed the report. What are Officer Ford's choices? Fess up. Lie. How about this intermediate choice? Tell the sergeant, well, we were both right together when the arrest was made. I did put my mitts on the guy, and I'm the one who took the narcotics out of his pocket, but Officer Lee was standing right there, and so it's a joint arrest, and that's why the report got written the way it did. Lee was witnessing everything that was done to minimize the impact on Lee. What do you think Ford did among those three things? Okay, now that's really an impractical question for 100 people sitting in a giant room, so I'll just tell you, raise your hand if you think it's most likely that Ford, seeing how this is shaping up 2 hours in, told the sergeant the truth. We have a minimum number of hands that counts to about 12 or 10 or 15 or something. Raise your hand if you think it's more likely that Officer Ford told the sergeant a half-truth. Well, I made the search, but he was standing right there. Okay, and raise your hand if you think he lied to the sergeant's face and said the report stands as written or something like that. Same number of hands that I saw for the first one. Ladies and gentlemen of my briefing, I'm afraid in this case, well, before I tell you, let me ask you a question. Those of you who raise your hand about he lied to the sergeant, either way, either the lie where he embellishes how many of them were there, or the lie about report stands as written, what could motivate an FTO who's done good work up to now and whose trainee made a mistake that he just learned about 2 hours prior to lie to his sergeant's face? What motivates deputy sheriffs and officers to lie to their sergeant? Okay, they don't want to look bad? That's right. That's an excellent, I don't know who said that, but I value that answer greatly because that's the one I hear the least. They don't want to look bad. The biggest fear in law enforcement is not getting hurt or shot. It's looking dumb to your peers, looking incompetent, letting your supervisors down, and having people who trust you as a weirdly squared away thinker out there find out that you've got a chink in your armor. So that's a very, very strong motivation for many officers to lie to their sergeant. Anything else? Besides don't want to look bad? Sorry? Well, he might be worried about discipline for somebody, for sure for the trainee potentially, and maybe for himself if he taught him that. We don't even know if he didn't. but we think he didn't. Nevertheless, he's responsible for that trainee. He's buddied up with him. They're good. He was going to get off training, and he doesn't want to see this guy have his career torched. So potentially he was doing short-sighted thinking about, well, I got to cover this because otherwise he'll get prosecuted for perjury or something. All right, I think it's really important for us to discuss with officers why people lie. Lying has caused more grief in our department than I can count, and it was my original inspiration for getting involved with this material. We need to do more about it. We need to get guys thinking straight. Most people don't lie. Most people who do lie only do it occasionally, but it doesn't make any difference when the chips are down and it's this bad. In this case, this officer lied to his sergeant's face and said, the report stands as written. Okay, so this all came out in the wash. It was an administrative investigation. The sergeant figured out eventually that the trainee was actually doing a warrant check at a different location from where the FTO bagged the guy in the first place, and so the story broke down. The problem for the FTO and the trainee is that because they had days off the next 2 days and didn't come forward, the criminal justice system wheels moved quickly for this person, and he was arraigned and pled guilty to possession of dope. And so on the strength of a false police report, we got a suspect already into the criminal justice system too far to undo it. Therefore, the district attorney, when he learned about this malfunction, filed criminal charges against which one, or both? Okay, some people say both. I thought that was possible, and I know it was because the DA considered filing conspiracy charges against the two guys, which sounds like humongously out of proportion to what they'd done to some people. To others, it sounds, Jake, that's what should have happened. In this case, they filed on just the trainee, and the FTO skated from the criminal justice system. He did face administrative discipline, and in this particular instance, both guys were discharged. The trainee was convicted. He pled guilty to misdemeanor perjury. There's such a charge in California in effect, and that's the way it turned out. Okay, I'm going back to my role as your presenter instead of your sergeant so that you can shut off my walk around mic. And I'll tell you that that was a little rough. Normally I'm sitting down, normally I'm in a briefing. Even without people that I know, because I do a lot of this kind of training with strangers now, in my efforts to encourage our sergeants in the Sheriff's Department to do this recurrently and with feeling. There's a lot of material out there, as I said, with a mother load still out there for us to tap into and mine. And the things that are in the book are a percent of what could be written up about the many, many ways that officers make mistakes that are either mistakes of the heart or mistakes of the mind. Either one, we want to correct them. And thank you for participating. You're an excellent group of deputies and officers, and I'd work with you anyway. I'm going to summarize real quick. Let's see. I have a handy timer here. Actually, we're doing all right on time. We're going to ask you if you have questions about this approach after we're done. But right now, I'll remind you, as I said, this is a low or no cost piece of business here. It's true people could buy the book and get a head start on it, and there's some cost there. But in terms of getting sergeants trained up for this, it doesn't take a lot of expense. And once they're doing it, it costs you nothing. It doesn't cost you bringing in a high-priced consultant to teach, all 10,000 or 2,000 or even 100 or even 10 of your people about, quote, ethics in law enforcement. And I emphasize the terminology decision-making in law enforcement. I use other terms besides the word ethics all the time because I know some people get their back up about, you can't teach me ethics. My parents already did that. I learned them in kindergarten or at church. It's unfortunate that in law enforcement, I've run into that problem so much. I've figured out what to do about it, though. I don't use the word. It's in the title of the book. My gosh, that's what it's about. But all the same, the word has controversial aspects to it in terms of some people's interpretation of what it means. So we're trying to train, equip, and inspire sergeants to be more effectively doing what we already expect them to do, and that's mentoring their personnel. When they talk with officers about the factors of police decision-making before the decision's necessary, we're just mimicking what we've done for 40 years about officer survival training. Hey, this deputy handled this call. There was a 211 now with 3 robbery suspects, and he didn't have any backup, and here's what he did, and let's find out what the tactics mistakes were. Let's make sure nobody makes those mistakes again, and all that jazz. It's a noble cause to train these guys about those things, and we do more of it for their physical survival than we do for their career survival, and that's what this approach is about. By the way, I had a lot of fun up here. I don't know you guys, and there's hundreds of you, but all the same, this stuff is fun to talk about. It's about police work. I emphasize it's about police work. Yeah, it's about ethics, but I whisper that. Let's talk about police work, just as I said when I began. So don't get the idea that this is any kind of a drag. It's actually fun to do, and it takes a little convincing of sergeants, but after an 8-hour course at our sheriff's department, we, Scott and I in particular, because there are many of us that teach how to do this to sergeants now in the sheriff's department, we have a number of sergeants, normally find, as Scott will be telling you momentarily, that the reaction is pretty good on the part of our sergeants. So I would like to introduce Captain Scott Gage, who has taken on the task as the Training Bureau commander of getting approximately 1,500 sergeants through training about how to use material like this with their own deputies.
Yes,
Scott, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So we created an 8-hour course. We entitled it Sergeant Mentoring Initiative with 2 goals in this course. One, the most important one, is to use this technique of talking about ethics without using the word ethics by using real-world police events. The second one is to change the mind of our sergeants and our personnel that ethics is a constant conversation. It's not something we just hire somebody else, but it's a perishable skill. You know, we send our people to firearms training. We send them to arrest and control. We send them to EVOC training. All of those are perishable skills, and we want to treat ethics as perishable skills. We think that there will be some pretty firm metrics that we'll be able to measure the success of this program. We won't see those for a while yet. We initiated our training about a year ago, and in that time we've trained about 1,000 of our sergeants and lieutenants, leaving us with between 400 and 500 to go. Ultimately, to measure the success, we're hopefully going to see a reduction in administrative investigation that lead to deputy discipline, deputies being discharged, fewer negative stories in the media which undermine the credibility of law enforcement across the nation, and thirdly, that fiscal impact that's associated with these decisions. But what we could measure right now was how the training was received by our sergeants, and then later on, how the training and the ethical talks and this technique was being received by the deputies. So we created a before course and after course survey that everybody coming to our 8-hour Sergeant Mentoring Initiative training takes. So prior to the sergeants coming into the training, about half of them come in with an open mind, believing that they will be able to conduct better briefings by using this technique. We significantly increase that after they come through the 8-hour course. That same question increases considerably. This is something we didn't quite expect the results on, as far as how that sergeant coming through the training was going to be impacted by this. Because the training is basically geared to help the deputies, help them with their decision making. But I think that constant conversation about how this is a perishable skill, actually the sergeants were seeing the rewards of it and how that could possibly help their career. This was a really good result. Just by employing this technique and doing these simple activities, these simple exercises, using real-world events, our sergeants believe, the vast majority of them believe that they're going to be better mentors. And we talk a lot about that at the sergeant rank, at the sergeant role. You're not just a supervisor, you're a mentor. And we're giving them the tools to actually become that good mentor. And a lot of them are recommending this class, which is great, but it really doesn't matter because we're forcing them all to come, but it's good to see that they're still appreciative of what they're getting received. I feel confident I can present these exercises. It is a very simple approach. We give them in the training course a real short introduction or review of adult learning concepts, and then we go right into the exercises. We keep the class sizes small so that everybody gets the chance to go through and basically put themselves in the role Mr. Tyler just did of actually giving a briefing. And they're able to take that away and they feel they can do this in a briefing setting. And they understand the adult learning concepts. Some of the quotes we get, outstanding again. They believe we're giving them tools, things changing the climate again, assisting them of doing their job better, becoming better mentors. So following them coming to the 8-hour training course, they then go back to their units of assignment and begin using this technique. Go to the briefing setting, engaging in one of the exercises that we provide them with, or using one that they've modified from other event that they're well-versed in and know about. And we wanted to gauge how well the deputies were responding to this, how well they were involved in the conversation, and the results, again, were really good. 80% of them saying good to very good interaction by the deputies when they were presenting the material. Again, the quotes affirm what we're doing, explaining and giving knowledge to the deputies why discipline is there, how these decisions are impacting all of law enforcement. So far, we're getting a pretty good result from this. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Obviously, this is a quick overview. We could go probably for several hours on this and get a lot more out of it, but we're constrained. But you see a common sense approach, well received by the people who are going to benefit from it, and certainly a value to the organization, not only today, but in the future. You think about our culture. We are an odd culture. I don't think there's anyone in this room that if you knew that there was someone in jeopardy in an alley and there was someone down there with a gun, you wouldn't hesitate to run down there and take care of business. But when it comes to pulling someone aside that either we supervise or that's a peer, and even though we know that you may be saving their lives down the road, we hesitate to do it. So while these techniques are very important, it takes an amount of courage to be able to do it as well. But I think the more we talk about these things, the more we can solidify in the next generation of police officers, deputy sheriffs, and police leaders, getting us back to the basics in this profession, that integrity is our currency, credibility is as well, and that we need to move forward knowing that what we expect from our people is what's going to actually occur from our people. We're charged with accomplishing something that's so critical to the American way of life, that we're subject to the intense level of scrutiny that we are today. This job has never been more complex or in some cases dangerous, and it seems without the support that our folks out there deserve every day. Officers out there handle millions of difficult, emotionally charged calls and events without controversy every year. Very little attention is paid to all of the calls that go well. Yet in those small number of instances where force is used or an outcome is controversial, our officers and our management of our agencies are put under a microscope and critiqued, and often not objectively. We should be taking every action we can to provide our people with the tools necessary to manage the tactical, ethical, and interpersonal challenges that they face out there every day. One such tool is this approach. Supervisors helping our officers learn from the past mistakes and develop the perspective, foresight, and wisdom necessary to keep their jobs and to be able to thrive in them and have a great career. That's really the goal of all of this, is to be able, if we can, to provide a tool that you can maybe take back and use. If there's any questions, feel free, throw them at us. But our goal here today is to be a resource for all of you. If we can send somebody to be able to help you set this up, if we can send information, if we can bring people into our organization for a period of time, we have a lot of people in the organization very committed to seeing this through, and we feel there's great value to it. Let me throw it out. Any thoughts, questions, suggestions? Somebody, Scott, do you have any?
Yes. Sir, this is designed so it can be customized to any agency. Can you talk a little bit about some of the perils that may exist if you were to create your own scenario and not using one from the book so they can use it?
Sure, yeah. I'd do better if I don't drop my phone on the floor. It was designed with the idea that in an agency of 10 people or 10,000, this can be used, it can be modified. Most of the stuff that's in the book was written about actual incidents that happened in the Sheriff's Department, which is a massive department. And even there, we have a few problems with picking situations that people won't know who did it. It's harder in an agency that's smaller, obviously, But there are a lot of ways to get around that. Of course, the book's a way to get a head start on having material that didn't happen to your officers, although any one of these could have happened to your officers, and similar things have happened all over the country. You know, these things are all masked in terms of who it was. The thing that I described about Ford and Lee, not their names, they weren't officers, they were deputies. And it happened so long ago, it's almost in the sands of time now. But they actually arrested a female. And it wasn't for meth, it was for some other drug. I mean, I changed as much as I could so people couldn't turn around and get angst about being outed. The same kinds of things can be done in a smaller agency. And of course, again, you have a head start if you're interested in looking at the book, because they're all about Sheriff's Department people, or made up in some cases. Making them up also works. But I personally like the technique of looking at an administrative investigation, or whatever you call the misconduct investigations, and getting the actual facts about decision-making, and then causing the officers to speculate on what motivated this bad decision. They're not all bad faith. They're not all because somebody was predestined from the day he was hired to do something terrible. Yeah, that's happened. Most of the ones I picked, I feel that they were just off their game about decision-making that day, and if they'd thought about it before, they may well have avoided misery for themselves. That's my hope. Thanks, Scott.
Oh, thank you. As you heard, really, we do tactical debriefs all the time, and we just don't take the time often enough to think about this in the same fashion. The results potentially just as damaging to a career or a life, and certainly to all of us in this profession. So thank you very much for your time today. Enjoy the rest of the conference. We appreciate the input you gave us as well. Thank you all.